Welcome everybody to our third Critical Antiquities workshop for this second half of the year. And let me begin by offering an acknowledgement of the country on which the Critical Antiquities workshop is taking place. So I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which at least I'm based at the moment, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And it is upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built, and we pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I would also like to add too that we're on land which was stolen and that we never gave back. Okay. So it is my very great pleasure today to introduce to everyone in the workshop Miguel Vatter from Deakin University. Miguel is professor at Deakin of political science, and one need only sort of enter his name briefly into Google to discover what an international authority he is on an extraordinary range of topics, and has published very widely books and articles on figures as significant and important as Machiavelli, Spinoza, Foucault, Arendt, Carl Schmitt, Giorgio Agamben, and on the subjects of biopolitics, democracy, and political theology. Miguel's most recent book is Living Law, Jewish Political Theology from Herman Cohen to Hannah Arendt, which was published by Oxford University Press last year, I believe. And so it's a very great pleasure to be able to host Miguel on the topic of Leo Strauss and Kelson on Aristotle and the question of natural right. So let's make Miguel very welcome.
Thank you very much, Ben and Tristan, for this invitation. It's a wonderful thing you have going here, Critical Antiquities. So I'm very honored to read this paper. So I'll get to it. The main question I'm interested in exploring here today is why so much of 20th century jurisprudence and political philosophy turns to a conception of law as nomos, in order to address what Strauss once called the problem of law and legitimacy. I think Strauss's reconstruction of quote-unquote classical natural right and quote-unquote Platonic political philosophy is a major part of this phenomenon. In this paper, I want to explore why, somewhat paradoxically, Aristotle became the decisive battleground in this 20th century jurisprudential struggle. Now, legitimacy became a problem in the early 20th century because of Max Weber's claim that in a modern socially differentiated order, legitimacy can only be achieved in and through legality. Legality, in turn, was conceived in positivist terms as an autopoietic, self-referential system of norms that coalesces into a bureaucratic form of government. For different reasons, this reduction of legitimacy to legality did not sit well with various parties interested in revolutionary changes of the liberal democratic state and its legal and economic orders, both from the left and from the right. Schmitt's polemic against Kelson fits in here, and I think so does Strauss's discourse on classical natural right. Now, in 1934, Schmitt published an essay called On the Three Kinds of Jurisprudential Thinking, in which he announced his turn away from decisionism and towards understanding law as quote-unquote a concrete order, and he used the Greek term nomos. In this text, he proceeded to offer a long discussion of what he termed the Platonic understanding of the formula nomos basileus. On October of the same year, Leo Strauss, who was very young at the time, wrote to his close friend Jakob Klein, who you probably know as quite a specialist in ancient Greek mathematics, whether he had read Schmitt's latest work. And in the letter he says, quote, he, namely Schmitt, now is against Hobbes' decisionism and for a quote-unquote thinking of order on the basis of the argument in my review essay, which he naturally does not cite, end quote. I love that. It's typical of the young scholar, right? Now, Strauss is obviously exaggerating the impact that his review essay on the concept of the political probably had on Schmitt's turn towards the idea of a concrete order, simply because Strauss's review essay never explicitly discussed Plato's conception of the nomos. He did talk about Plato, but never the nomos. However, Strauss's admission is indicative of the closeness that he perceived between his position and Schmitt's approach to the problem of law and legitimacy, a closeness that I argue remains evident in his later works like On Tyranny and Natural Right and History, as I will show in a second. During that same period, Strauss had been working on material that would be soon published in the 1935 book called Philosophy and Law. This material involved a study of Jewish and Islamic medieval prophetology and its debt to the reception of Platonic political philosophy. The point of that book was to show, quote, that the idea of law, of nomos, is what unifies Jews and Greeks. The idea of the concrete, binding order of life, which is covered over for us by the Christian and natural right traditions. This idea is the one under whose spell, at least my philosophical thought moves, end quote. The Strauss and Schmidt coincide in those years of the centrality of nomos as concrete order, even if they part ways with regard to the unity of Plato and Judaism. Now, in order to appreciate the rather technical and somewhat dry second half of this paper, I think I should explain what is at issue in this shift to understand law as nomos in the 20th century, and then proceed to show why and how the debate between Schmidt, Kelson, and Strauss seems to have taken place at the level of Aristotelian rather than Platonic interpretation. For Schmidt, the idea of nomos basileos means that one has to understand law from kingship and not the other way around. It is only the legitimacy of an authoritative command that grounds the legality of the law. That is why Schmidt defines nomos as, quote, the full immediacy of a legal force not mediated by laws. It's a very problematic definition. This undermines, of course, the basis of any Republican understanding of the rule of law, that is based on the idea that laws actually temper the kind of kingly power. Schmidt conjured this idea of the nomos precisely in order to deconstruct Kelson's positivist idea that a system of laws can actually rule over individuals. For Schmidt, that was nonsense. Only individuals rule over individuals, not laws. Laws cannot rule because they do not apply themselves. They need judges to apply them. And judges, according to Schmidt, are not constituted by laws, but, quote, from a concrete organization of the judiciary apparatus and of concrete personal designations and nominations, end quote. So legality really exists only within a legitimate but pre-legally imposed concrete order. Now, second, a nomos for Schmidt designates a way of life, and norms or laws emerge from it as determination of what is normal or natural for this way of life. Schmidt's understanding of nomos thus recovers the idea of classical natural right. That is, this is the general belief that norms emerge from what is natural to something, from the nature of something. I'll return to this point later, obviously in more detail. Schmidt gives us examples of normal life in this normative sense within a concrete institution. So these are his examples, quote unquote, life in common of spouses within marriage, of members of a family within the family, of members of a clan within a clan, of the functionaries of the state, of the priests of a church, and so on. They're all, of course, concrete institutional orders that generate their own norms. Third point, for Schmidt, nomos, as you probably know, he takes it to derive from the Greek neme, and he claims the primary sense of this verb is that of an appropriation of land, a land grab, ultimately for the purposes of shepherding. So I'm not going to get into the etymology and the whole huge debate on this, but this is what he says. The nomos is the immediate configuration in which the social and political order of a people becomes spatially visible, the first measurement and division of the fields, or, according to the elegant English expression, the radical title. The nomos is the measure that divides and determines the lands in accordance with a precise order, full stop. Now, I could have written a whole paper about how this applies to Australia and the terra nullius, but we're not going to get into that right now. My point here is simply a normative one, which is for Schmidt, the taking of land and its nomothetic division are not two separate acts, one being violent, colonial, imperialist, and so on, and the other rational and measured. But they're actually joined together as a primeval expression of legitimate power. It is the ancestral grabbing, measuring, and dividing up of land that establishes what is right, what then will become, in the Greek, or was to dikaion, as something objective that is related to the establishing of a political place or space, rather than, as the moderns have it, something subjective, where what is right is related to the will of individuals. For Schmitt, this already implies that there is a spatial division. Now, fourth and last, I'm glad Andreas is here. I don't know what he thinks about this. Schmitt actually back then leans on fragment 114 by Heraclitus to determine the last meaning of nomos as a sacred enclosure or sanctuary. And this is the fragment by Heraclitus that he cites. Those who speak with sense must rely on what is common to all, as a city must rely on its law, nomos, and with much greater reliance. For all the laws, nomoi, of men are nourished by one law, the divine law, for it has as much power as it wishes and is sufficient for all and is still left over, end quote, in the English translation. Now, Schmitt takes this fragment to mean that, quote, the nomos can grow and multiply like the land and patrimony. It is from the unique divine nomos that all the human nomoi nourish themselves. I shall leave this point aside here for a moment, but obviously this idea of a single divine nomos underlying all the human nomoi is ultimately what I think lies behind Strauss's interest in the whole question, and why he believes that this idea of nomos, this Greek idea of nomos, actually can help to unify the Jewish and the Greek perspective. The Jews obviously have something to say about a single divine nomos. For Schmitt, the nomos, though, allowed, in this sense of sacred enclosure, allows the separation of natives and foreigners. That is, it allows to distinguish between private adversaries within the sacred enclosure and public enemies, those who are outside, clearly delineating those against whom one can engage in a war while prohibiting civil war, war within the sacred enclosure. Schmitt sees the greatest achievement of nomos in what he calls a limitation of war. That is, it's not eliminating war, but directing it against the proper enemies, which he claims is a central problem of all juridical order. Now, my question is this: why did this discussion on nomos turn around the interpretation of Aristotelian natural right? After all, did not Strauss say that Christian natural right, obviously feeding off Aristotle, occluded the authentic principles of nomos? Although in the early 30s, Schmitt himself defended this idea of nomos or concrete order on the basis of his reading of Plato's doctrine of kinship, by the time he writes the Nomos of the Earth in the early 50s, he argued that Plato in the Statesman and Laws does actually not offer a conception of nomos as something different and anterior to the decrees of the popular assembly of Psephisma. So he says that Plato is actually not the originator of his sense of the nomos. Instead, he claims that it was only Aristotle who established the veritable distinction between nomos, in his sense, and written positive laws. In this context, he refers to Aristotle's claim that Solon and Lycurgus are both nomos givers because they created a politeia and nomoi by dividing the lands and abolishing debts, and both required a concrete measurement conceived essentially of space, a spatial division. And second, Schmitt values Aristotle's interpretation, what he takes to be Aristotle's interpretation of nomos basileos, to mean the constitutional, quote unquote, domination of middle-class property owners, the famous mesoi, in opposition to a society dominated either by the rich or by the poor. Okay, so let me talk about Strauss a little bit now. I do not know for sure whether Schmitt continued to read Strauss's wartime writings on Xenophon, but in Strauss we also find a marked shift from Plato towards Aristotle in the aftermath of World War II. Around the time of his immigration to the United States in the late 30s, Strauss came to believe that the works of Xenophon offered the best approximation to what was really at stake in the problem of Platonic political philosophy, that is, the problem of the relation between a philosophical and a political life, or wisdom and democracy. Now, in his first American book called On Tyranny, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, Strauss employed Xenophon's dialogue hero to demonstrate a new and unorthodox thesis, namely that the whole of Socratic political philosophy actually contains a tyrannical teaching, because it defends the idea that, quote unquote, beneficent tyranny is highly desirable. In his commentary on the hero, Strauss argues that Xenophon's dialogue deconstructs the difference between legitimate king and illegitimate tyrant, that is, between rule with laws over willing subjects, that's the king, and rule without laws over unwilling subjects, the tyrant, in order precisely to claim that, quote, tyranny may live up to the highest political standard, end quote. Now, in order to substantiate this quite shocking and sort of provocative reading, Strauss obviously has to cast doubt on the traditional reading of Socrates' political beliefs, which were expressed by Xenophon himself in Memorabilia 4.4. Now, what Xenophon says there is that for Socrates, virtue or justice is the same as legality or obedience to laws, and is thus incompatible with tyranny, understood as rule without laws. So what does Strauss say? He replies to this objection by saying that, quote, tyranny would become morally possible if the identification of just, in quotation marks, and legal, in quotation marks, were not absolutely correct. Or if, quotation marks, everything according to law were only somehow just, end of quotation. Now, the last phrase is a citation from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, 1129b12, which Strauss leaves without commentary. This is typical of Strauss, and which is usually rendered as, quote, whatever is lawful is in some way just. This all-important reference to Aristotle suggests that for Strauss, the defense of government by law over government by persons in the third book of Aristotle's Politics is really only partially correct, probably just rhetorical, and is not the whole truth. Such an unexpected appeal to Aristotle in a commentary on Xenophon reveals, I think, Strauss's strategic use of Aristotle to bolster the thesis that the natural right distinction between the just and the legal argues in favor of the Platonic possibility of a beneficent tyranny. Now, and here I get into the Aristotle. Strauss's treatment of Aristotle in Natural Right and History is very elusive. That's his major work after the war. Not only because he never acknowledges any tradition of scholarship on Aristotle and law, but also because his pronouncements on this topic do not directly refer to any Aristotelian text. For this reason, I find it very useful to try to situate Strauss's in-between-the-lines reading of Aristotle's Injustice in the context of some other approaches to the topic by his own contemporaries, among whom Kelson stands out. Now, let me return to the crucial phrase that Strauss cites from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics in On Tyranny. This is the following. This is Aristotle. Since, as we saw, the lawless person is unjust and the lawful person is just, it clearly follows that whatever is lawful is in some way just, for the provisions of legislative science are lawful, and we say that each of them is just, end quote. Now, as you know, in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle distinguishes between a general and a particular sense of justice, which corresponds to his intuition that, quote, both the lawful and the fair person will be just. Hence, what is just will be both what is lawful and what is fair or equitable, end quote. So general justice is given by laws, and following the laws is complete virtue. Again, Aristotle, quote, the actions producing the whole of virtue are the lawful actions that the laws prescribe for education, promoting the common good, end quote. Particular justice, instead, deals with what is fair or equitable and unfair. It refers both to the distribution of things or parts to a group or community, that's distributive justice, and to the rectifications in transactions or commutative justice. So in order to be just, the division and rectification must be equal in either a proportional or in an arithmetic sense. It must be fitting to a person's worth, and it involves equity, epieikeia. Quote, for the people involved are not equal, they will not justly receive equal shares. According to the Thomist reception of these texts, the distinction between the legal and the fair or equitable refers to the possibility that what is just by nature, to dikaion phusei, is not the same as the legal, and therefore the Aristotle's conception of equity reveals a doctrine of natural law understood as a doctrine in which morality trumps legality. Now, generally speaking, Strauss's position in Aristotle's theory of justice rejects such a moralistic reading of Aristotle's natural right doctrine, but he also rejects the positivistic reading of Aristotle that had been put forward by Kelson in the 1950s, which I find very interesting. And here, let me talk a little bit about this. Now, why did people move to Aristotle after the war in such a fashion? I think that by the 1950s, Jacques Maritain's neo-Aristotelian defense of democracy and human rights had won the day, basically. I mean, it was the doctrine of the United Nations, and it had won the day. In many ways, this discourse set the stage for both Kelson and Strauss's return to Aristotle. Kelson, of course, was keen to deny that Aristotle's theory of law is compatible with a traditional Thomistic understanding of natural law, and he did so for democratic reasons. His Aristotle is the radical defender of legality as the sole source of legitimacy. For Kelson, in fact, Aristotle's theory of law is entirely positivist. Now I'm quoting Kelson, quote, "Virtue is something which the statesman as lawgiver desires to bring about, in that he persuades the citizens to obey the laws of the state, and therefore positive law. Justice is a virtue, indeed the perfect and complete virtue, a virtue of the citizen, and as such it consists in behaving according to positive law. Thus, already in Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle is excluding in advance any justice distinct from positive law," end quote. That's Kelson. And Kelson adds, for good measure, quote, "The legislator, not nature, makes the citizens virtuous, and therefore also just. He makes them virtuous, and more especially just, by making them obedient to the laws," end quote. Now, obviously, the figure of the legislator that Kelson has in mind is Aristotelian in a sort of derivative sense, in the sense that he clearly has in mind the human legislator of Dante and Marsilius. That is, basically, the democratic people represented in an assembly as nomothetes. And for Kelson, the difference between good and bad legislators, good and bad constitutions, does not have to do with good legislators being morally virtuous or good constitutions being modeled on some idea of natural justice. The difference is simply that a bad legislator, quote, "does not employ the proper means of securing the citizens' obedience to the laws he has enacted. All political virtue is dependent on the positive legal constitution, no matter what it is. The constitutions can give rise to better or worse laws if applied improperly." So interesting, this idea. There is no bad legal constitution for Kelson. Kelson argues that the principle then of fairness or equity does not stand at the same level as the identity between the just and the legal. Quote, "All the norms of positive law are just, but within those norms there are some which are just in a particular sense, those which apply the principle of fairness." He then points out that for Aristotle, positive laws that are not for the common good, but for the advantage of the dominant group, are no less legal, thus legitimate or just. Quote, "Hence, every legal order which distributes duties and rights according to some subjective and thus relative value, and every positive legal order does that, can be vindicated as conforming to the principle of fairness," end quote. For Kelson, this argument refutes the claim that Aristotle has a theory of natural law, since any doctrine of natural law would have to allow for a conflict between the legally just and the equitable that is not found in Aristotle. Now, Aristotle says that, quote, again, I'm quoting from the Nicomachean Ethics, "What is politically just must conform to law and apply to those who are naturally suited for law, hence to those who have equality in ruling and being ruled," end quote. On this basis, Kelson advises a very strong thesis that, quote, "by physikon and nomikon dikaion, Aristotle means to distinguish two kinds of positive law in the state. This is possible because to dikaion means both justice and positive law, such that the naturally just," so the physikon dikaion, refers to, quote, "that which everywhere has the same force and does not exist by people's thinking this or that." That's from Aristotle. What this means for Kelson is that the naturally just, physikon dikaion, is still given by positive laws. But these are laws which specifically regulate a matter which can only be so regulated and not otherwise, such as the norms forbidding murder and theft. And these norms are opposed to other positive laws which specifically regulate a matter which can nonetheless be regulated also in another fashion, as for example, in norms regulating traffic. So basically, the distinction between natural right and conventional right is still within a positive law distinction. Given that what is by nature right is in fact a species of positive law, Kelson then says, it's not surprising at all that Aristotle is bound to reject the view that the naturally just is unchangeable. Now, Kelson's most audacious claim is that Aristotle always, quote, uses the concept of natural law himself only to vindicate positive law, as can be seen particularly in his attitude of the question of slavery. Aristotle defends this institution on the ground that there are men who are by nature slaves, phusei doulos, end quote. Now, this is really interesting, I find. Kelson has the hypothesis that Aristotle employs the sophist distinction between what is right by nature and what is right by law or convention, but only in order to turn it against the sophist, by showing that what is just is always and only what is posited as law by a human legislator. It is not at first sight evident, to me at least, what Kelson is referring to by claiming that natural slaves prove the thesis that all law is positive law. I think what he's referring to is an argument a contrario, namely, those who argue that slavery is only by convention must posit that there is a natural justice that is not positive, and which would make slavery by nature illegal. Whereas, on the contrary, the belief in the existence of natural slaves indicates that positive law is not merely right by convention, but also by nature. In fact, this is how Kelson understands Aristotle's claim that human beings are by nature political beings and that the city is, quote, by nature. For Kelson to say that the state is a product of nature, as appears in the Politics, is simply to say that, quote, positive laws are natural and every state has a legal order. And so therefore this law, which is essential to the state, namely positive law, must be a product of nature, natural law. And since it is this law which is the determination of what is just, it follows that every system of positive law must be a phusei dikaion, even if Aristotle does not so term it in the present context, end quote. In other words, there is no naturally just, because what is quote unquote natural is precisely the existence of positive law as a kind of law found in every single political organization known to human beings without exception. Now, Kelson does concede that there are two parts, two topoi in Aristotle's treatment of justice, which possibly may indicate a divergence in his otherwise constant teaching that the just is the legal. The first of these topoi is every time that Aristotle talks about a natural foundation to justice, for example, what we just saw, the theory of the natural slaves. And the second topos relates to the difference between a good man, spudaios, and a good citizen in Aristotle's text. Kelson admits that by making this distinction, Aristotle may be backing away from his basic point that positive law is identified with justice. Indeed, even the positivist reading leaves open the question of whether the virtue of the lawgiver, that is the spudaios, is different than the one of the citizen. I'll return to this point. Now, not by chance, Strauss's interpretation of Aristotle, natural right and history, will focus on precisely these two sort of limit examples that Kelson concedes. Strauss's basic point is that if justice generally means following the laws, then the lawgiver cannot simply be a citizen or the citizen, since he stands above and before the laws. And thus the lawgiver may be guided by other laws or rules, by other nomoi, than the laws of general or particular justice. Now, to understand what Strauss is after, I'll talk a little bit. I think it's useful here to follow another controversial jurist, namely Michel Villet's interpretation of Aristotle's to dikaion. In his many writings on the topic, Villet argues that the novelty of Aristotle's discussion lies precisely in this concept of to dikaion as a legal form of justice, which he relates to the particular conception of justice, and refers to the idea of taking only what is due to one's just part in a given distribution. In this sense of what is just, Aristotle's to dikaion is closely related to the determination of law by the decisions that judges make when they have to distribute goods between parties in conflict. And Villet says the dikaion is the distribution, the just relation, the distributed part, which it is up to the judge to determine. But in a crucial departure from a legalistic or positivist reading that we saw in Kelson, Villet says that to dikaion in Aristotle ultimately refers to the fact that, quote, the office of the judge is to verify the justice of distributions that have already been made. We do not know very well by who, end quote. In his writings, Villet never, of course, mentions Schmidt's conception of nomos as concrete normative order based on acts of appropriation. But it is clear that such a conception of the nomos as an originary appropriation and division of land, I think, is the only possible reference to what Villet refers to as, quote, the distributions that have already been made before any judge is set up. We do not know very well by who, end quote. As Villet and Schmidt would say that for Aristotle, the role of the judge is to guard for the justice, to Deakin, of the distributions of the originary nomos. This reference to a previous nomos that is presupposed by Aristotle's concept of political justice, to Deakin politikon, viz., that is, a nomos that has been given by transpolitical nomothetes rather than by judges or magistrates, is then picked up by Strauss's distinction between decisions made for the sake of the common good, which are ultimately made by philosophical-like actors, and decisions on distributive and commutative justice, which are made by judges. Indeed, for Strauss, the reference to nomos as natural right is necessary because he claims positive law contains always a contradiction. And here's a long quote from Strauss. The law claims that it saves the cities. It claims to secure the common good. But the common good is exactly what we mean by the just. Laws are just to the extent that they're conducive to the common good. But if the just is identical with the common good, the just or right cannot be conventional, because the conventions of a city cannot make good for the city what is, in fact, fatal for it, and vice versa. The nature of things, and not convention, then determines in each case what is just. To establish what is just in each case is the function of a political art or skill. That art or skill is comparable to the art of the physician, who establishes what is in each case healthy or good for the human body, end quote. So Strauss adopts Aristotle's claim that despite legal systems varying from one city to the other, there is still, and this is Strauss's phrase, one system that is by nature the best. Now, this best system, or if you wish, the best regime, refers, according to Strauss, to that, quote, knowledge of what is just here and now, which is knowledge of what is by nature or intrinsically good for the city here and now, end quote. Clearly, such knowledge rests on the possibility that something like Aristotelian phronesis exists and provides incontestable knowledge as to what is right by nature in every ethical political situation. And I think at the same time, Strauss's understanding of the phronimos here is strongly skewed to a Platonic ideal of the virtuous ruler as a living law that we find in the statesman. Now, I think with this, I'm coming to a conclusion. Sorry about the time. The key to Strauss's mature writings, I think, lies in understanding why the Aristotelian statesman, as Spudaios or Phronimos, takes over from the Platonic philosopher king, while maintaining at all times the insight of an internal connection between wisdom and tyranny, that is, the possibility and necessity of beneficent tyranny. Now, for Strauss, the ideal Platonic society in which justice, which he defines as what is good in each case for the soul, in which justice is realized because wise men are in absolute control, this is Strauss, turns out to be impractical. This is Strauss's thesis after the war. Plato never meant for philosopher kings to be taken seriously. However, most Straussian interpreters believe that the reason why Strauss says that is because they think that no philosopher will ever want to rule, because they're so enamored of the free contemplative life. I think quite the opposite. I think that what Strauss meant to say is that the philosopher king's solution is impractical because the political requirements of philosophical wisdom stand opposed to the political requirements of civil freedom advocated by citizens in republics. So Strauss first demonstrates the necessity of this tension between wisdom and consent. For Strauss, according to his Plato, wisdom requires that individuals control their lower impulses by ruling their bodies. This rule is like that of a master of a slave. It is not done through persuasion alone, but requires self-coercion. Strauss then shows that the relation between the wise and the multitude would require generalizing the treatment of slaves by masters. Quote, what is true of self-restraint, self-coercion, and power over oneself applies in principle to the restraint and coercion of others and to power over others. In fact, it is not altogether wrong to describe justice as a kind of benevolent coercion. Justice and virtue in general are necessarily a kind of power. Quote, this is Strauss. Strauss's conception of justice seems to presuppose an idea of natural slaves for whom such coercion, such benevolent coercion, would conceivably not be unjust. The Strauss here seems to be taking Kelson's argument in the opposite direction. If natural slavery can be employed to justify the identity of the politically just with legal equality, as Kelson shows, then perhaps it can also be employed to justify the identity of the politically just with natural equality, natural inequality of rank and status, as Strauss wants to do. However, Strauss's more general point is that in a democratic polity, citizens will never consent to being treated like natural slaves. Given that wisdom is what it is, and human beings are what they are, it follows that the wise cannot possibly rule directly over the many. It becomes necessary, according to Strauss, then, if the wise do want to rule at all, to adopt Aristotle's corrections and critiques of Plato. On the Aristotelian correction, the rule of the household must be distinguished from political rule proper, and thus a beneficent tyranny needs to justify itself before citizens who think of themselves as free and equal and do not understand themselves as natural slaves, nor as women or children. So Strauss, the city requires that wisdom be reconciled with consent. Here's my conclusion. Now, in Natural Right and History, Strauss argues that this reconciliation of wisdom with consent is the key to understanding Aristotle's idea of natural right, that privileges concrete decisions over general rules. And he goes on to formulate his own kind of quasi-Aristotelian definition of classical natural right. Quote, in every human conflict, there exists the possibility of a just decision based on full consideration of all the circumstances, a decision demanded by the situation. Natural right just simply consists of such decisions. As Strauss emphasizes, his interpretation of natural right departs both from the Everistic and the Thomistic traditions. For both of these traditions emphasize the priority of the legal norm over the moment of decision. The difference is that for the Averroist tradition, all normative codes are ultimately conventional rules, whereas for the Thomist tradition, all normative codes ultimately rest on unexceptionable rules or natural law. So for Strauss, natural right resides in concrete decisions and not in general rules, because of the difference that he always remarks between the principles of commutative and distributive justice on the one hand, and the common good as object of general justice. In normal situations, Strauss says, the common good is given expression through these two types of legal justice. But the common good must also take into account, quote, the mere existence, the mere survival, the mere independence of the political community. Let us call an extreme situation a situation in which the very existence or independence of a society is at stake. In extreme situations, the normally valid rules of natural right are justly changed, or changed in accordance with natural right. The exceptions are as just as the rules. And Aristotle seems to suggest that there's not a single rule, however basic, which is not subject to exception, end quote. At this pivotal moment of Strauss' entire reconstruction of classical natural right, his discourse dovetails with the problem of the decision on the state of exception, which had been brought to prominence by Schmidt's political theology in the first place. The actual passage in which Strauss tries to justify his turning the state of exception to every human law into what safeguards the very possibility of a natural right and therefore of legitimacy is really remarkable. So I cite it in full. This is Strauss, quote, there is no principle which defines clearly in what type of cases the public safety and in what type of cases the particular precise rules of justice have priority. For it is not possible to define precisely what constitutes an extreme situation in contradistinction to a normal situation. Every dangerous external or internal enemy is inventive to the extent that he is capable of transforming what, on the basis of previous experience, could reasonably be regarded as a normal situation into an extreme situation. Natural right must be mutable in order to be able to cope with the inventiveness of wickedness, end quote. Now, obviously, this is a very, written in the 50s, a statement which has incredible pathos at the time, right? It seems to reflect what Strauss believed happened with the accession of power to Hitler. So an inventiveness of wickedness that could turn what seemed to be a normal situation into an extreme situation and take advantage of it. It possibly also reflects the Cold War and under, a sort of nuclear war conditions at the times. But that's what he says. Now, what's fascinating to me is that Strauss never gives any reference to texts of Aristotle that suggests that there could be such an idea of inventiveness of wickedness, that somehow Aristotle's idea of natural right would be responding to. The only possible source that I can think of, and maybe the listeners can correct me on this, is Aristotle's distinction in the Nicomachean Ethics between the phronimos and the deinos. The deinos is an individual who has the cleverness to make the right choices in terms of the means to attain the ends, but is indifferent to whether the end is good or bad. Now, Pierre Robin has argued that the figures of the phronimos and the deinos are actually quite close to each other in Aristotle. And he even defines prudence, phronesis, at one point as, quote, the cleverness of the virtues. This distinction between prudence and cleverness serves Aristotle to discuss his thesis of the mutual presupposition of virtue and prudence, which elaborates to the analogy that prudence is to cleverness as moral virtue is to natural virtue. Aristotle's point is not only that natural virtues do not by themselves aim at the good, but conversely that the moral virtue which aims at the good must itself be guided by the right principle, which for Aristotle refers to phronesis. Thus, it is, and as he quote, Obenk is quoting Nicomachean Ethics, the possession of the single virtue of prudence that will carry with it the possession of them all. I think, in my opinion, Obenk is correct to point out that the distinction between moral virtue and natural virtue refers to a distinction between those nomothetes, givers of law, who in giving law to the city do so in virtue of being phronimos as a living law, and the citizens of the city who, in following the stipulations of the lawgivers, live in accordance to the right principle. It is interesting to note, and with this I close, that at the end of this discussion, Aristotle reasserts the difference between wisdom and prudence. Quote from Aristotle, "Prudence does not assert authority over wisdom, for it does not use wisdom, but provides for its realization, and therefore issues orders not to wisdom, but for its sake. Besides, it would be like saying that political science controls the gods because it gives instructions about everything in the state," end quote. And here Aristotle does seem to be saying that the nomothetes, or original lawgivers, must have some kind of theological knowledge derived from a philosophical wisdom, which is not accessible as such to political science in its Aristotelian meaning, if their political ordering or nomoi are going to lead the citizens to virtue and at the same time realize the requirements of what is truly good. As far as I can tell, Strauss never mentions this passage directly, but it is not accidental that the only reference in natural right and history that he does provide to his whole discussion of Aristotelian phronesis is to a chapter of his own book called The Persecution and the Art of Writing on medieval Islamic and Jewish philosophers, and how they connected the doctrine of natural right to the Aristotelian God as well as to the God of the prophets. In that book, Strauss argued that the medieval philosophers, falasifa, so not Christians, but Jews and Arabs, understood Aristotle's belief in, quote, one system which is by nature the best everywhere. They understood this idea to refer to the rules that philosophers and prophets give themselves for the ruling of cities. It is these divine nomoi that compose at once the content of natural right and the law of reason characteristic of natural right doctrines. And in this way, Strauss signaled the continuity of his mature interpretations of Plato and Aristotle with the very problems that had cast a spell on him in the early 1930s. So thank you, and apologies for such a long paper.
Thank you, Miguel. That was really a tour de force, and my head's brimming with ideas about how this this whole discussion intersects with our very moment in history, and the parallel between Strauss reflecting on the wickedness, the inventiveness of wickedness, and similar concerns that you could speak of today is very interesting. But let me turn it over to the audience for questions. I have some questions, but I want to cede the floor just to the audience and see if there's anyone ready to go there. As with our usual practice, if you could use the chat function to indicate if you have a question, that would be great. So you can type the letter Q, and we'll be able to take note of the questioners, or else you can raise your hand, or else you can type the question in the chat and I can read it. So is there anyone who has a question off the bat?
It's probably too dense, so I'm sorry. Apologies for that.
It's great, Ben.
Yeah, it's not so much a question, but just somebody observation from someone coming in from the side who's not as familiar with Schmidt and Strauss as he ought to be, but I thought that it was an extraordinarily rich and interesting paper, and I'm glad that we're recording it, because I'm going to go back and listen to it even more carefully. It struck me that there's a whole kind of world of Roman law that could have a lot to sort of to add to this as well. And I'm just kind of curious about not only in relation to your paper, but in relation to the questions that you're sort of working within in general, the question of the not so much the contribution of Roman jurists to these questions, but even, you know, to go back to the question of what nomos means and its kind of its etymology and its derivation, and to some extent what's sort of pregnant within that or latent within that. To go back to this idea of sovereignty in early Rome, you know, where it just seems to me that early Rome bequeaths so much of that theological content in the idea of law. And I know I'm not really sort of asking you to comment on that. I'm just sort of throwing that in there as you were talking. I kept thinking about, you know, the augural law in Rome and the kind of the idea of exactly what it is that confers on the king, you know, his ability to dispense justice, and even to the idea that it's been noted by some scholars that the verb to rule in Latin, regere, has its kind of origins in the idea of defining boundaries, right? So the verb regere only takes an accusative, only takes an object when it refers to boundaries. So this idea of defining boundaries in the distribution of land, for instance, you talk about nemane and so on. Seems to me quite just really fascinating. But anyway, look, it's not anything really to do with Strauss or Schmidt, but I just wanted to indicate to you the kind of the fertility of your discussion and my thinking. Yeah.
Miguel, do you want to respond to that? If not, I can throw to Andre, who has a question.
Sure, I'll just respond very quickly, because it's very interesting, Ben, what you say, and you're right. I think there is a kind of concerted attempt by these German authors in a way to oppose Greek to Roman in this case. Nomos to lex. I think because they are so keen on trying to figure out a conception of law that is ultimately not Christian, and therefore also not coming from the Roman Empire, right? So that translation of imperium from Roman to Christian empires that's the backbone of, in a way, the Thomistic interpretation of Aristotle, right? If you read his treatise
right.
on justice and on law, you see that it's only Roman sources, essentially, of course, Aristotle, and then biblical sources, but they were very keen to try to separate this, right? And the theology behind this is because, in a way, well, Schmidt was, well, it's complicated. I think it opens up a whole thing. But if I'm right to say that, I think in a way, people like Maritain are the actors here against which these other interpretations of Aristotle's relation to right are pushing against, then they want to go back to more archaic Greek roots. Having said that, of course, Strauss does want to say, once he's figured out his interpretation of how Plato and Aristotle connect in classical natural right, he will then always, in natural right and history, cite Cicero as support to everything. So there is that, right? And in particular, in a nutshell, what Strauss is saying is that essentially Aristotle was needed because he provided the correct rhetoric to make Platonic ideas of justice digestible in a democratic polity. And so Strauss always loves to connect this rhetorical understanding of what Aristotle natural right is about to what Cicero has to say about rhetoric and constitutio, and the connection between, the lawgiver as a rhetorician, right? This has become the Ciceronian basis of a kind of republican tradition. So it's problematic because, in a way, through this channel and through Cicero, you can, as I see it, infect the whole republican tradition with a kind of virus that is very problematic. And I think that was the intention, if you ask me. But
Thank you,
Andre.
Yeah, thank you so much, Miguel. It was dense, as you said. So I have four, perhaps five small points, which are not really directed to the thesis that you are defending, and about which I might perhaps ask something, but there are minor points but which interest me. So the first one is about Kelson. So the way, as I understand it, in which Kelson describes Aristotle's theory. So am I right if I summarize that by saying that legality is natural or something like that? So that's Epicurus theory. So that's what everything that you said about, Kelson description of what Aristotle is doing, you can find in Epicurus' theory of justice. So I think, so what I would be interested in is to know, whether Epicurus is part of the debate. Probably not, because Aristotle, but maybe so. So that is one question. The second question is about Strauss. So actually, I was not aware of. You went very rapidly, but if I understand rightly, you think that there is a major evolution in Strauss thinking, so simplifying from a certain conception of Plato or Platonism to Aristotelianism. That I would like to know whether that is right. And then I have a subsidiary question here, because at some point you said that after the war, Strauss that was about impossibility of the Basilius king, but and you link that with the ironical interpretation of Plato. But I thought that this ironical interpretation of Plato Plato's political theory was actually very early. So it appears before the war. So if you can clarify that, I would be grateful. Third, about Schmidt. So you said you don't want to speak about the etymology of nomos, but this is an interesting point, because there is one thing in which Schmidt is absolutely right, that nomos has something to do with distribution. Actually, if you open an etymological handbook or whatever, Chantraine, you find that nomos is related to nemein, and to nemein means distribute, and you have very clear evidence that this is the case in Homer and very. So what is surprising in what is not clear at all, and actually I think false, is that nomos has something with seizing of the land, because seizing of the land, so that comes from, I think, Pindar, quote in Plato, nomos basileus.
That's right.
So because and that's exactly the kind of representation of nomos which Plato fights again. So so how does Schmidt goes from, how does Schmidt conceive the whole thing in order to start with Pindar, and then perhaps without naming it, but I think the reference is clear, to the distribution, and subordinate the distribution to the seizing of land. Yeah. So this move, I understand why Schmidt does that, but I don't understand how he does that. Fourth, it's not a question, well, it's a question to you. Do you know the work of Alain Soupiot?
Yeah, I only know his name. I haven't.
Okay, yeah. So that's extremely interesting for the following reason. First, because I think he is extremely interesting. So his work is Homo Juridicus, the title of his work, and then he has in recent years developed some very interesting thought about what in French is called le droit social. So I don't know if you can say that in English, social rights or social whatever. I wouldn't know how to translate that, droit social. And the idea is that le droit social is what, in a sense, corresponds to what I understand Schmidt is doing with concrete order. So concrete order is the right of organizations that need state organization. By the way, you didn't pronounce, I think, the word state, which has something to do with what legality is in modern times. And okay, so that might be something that you might want to say something about. And so the idea is, the Soupiot's idea is that the order of right of, I don't know if it's English again, the order of right goes beyond the law. So it's yes. It's law is an empire, but it has so many other things that, okay. So that's a very interesting, because perhaps counterpart to Schmidt's, because Soupiot basically is left. I mean, is left. He thinks social right from the left, and not from the right. So what I mean is that concrete order may mean something other than what Schmidt does with that. And then last question about your own take. So you like dovetailing between the extremes, right? So you have between. So So strange encounters. So, for example, the particular in the case of so phronesis, in as much as it has something to do with deciding here and now, so differently in each case, has something to do with with exception and the state of exception. So my question is, beyond the fascination of this encounter, what do you make of it? What is, after the description, what is the philosophical consequences or whatever? Yeah.
Wow, okay, Andre, that's a lot. I will try to go quickly. I think let me start with the Schmidt and the Nomos. I think everything that you say is correct, and I think in the 30s, Schmidt, I think, was reading a lot of the literature coming from German philology that wanted to say that Plato was a thinker of the monarchic principle, and Schmidt uses a lot the monarchic principle for his idea of constitutionalism. You and I have spoken about this. His theory of the constitution says that every constitution must also contain a monarchic principle. Sometimes it even seems as if he's channeling the laws there. But in any case, I think he was playing around with this idea, and the initial idea was that he wanted to defend, to attack Kelson's idea of nomos basileus, meaning as the rule of law, or the kingly rule of law, and instead he wanted to say, no, all law depends on the previous legitimacy of a kingly rule. But I think that by the time he moves after the war, like everybody else, he's dropped Plato, and he thinks that Plato is actually, funnily enough, I would say Plato is now become a liberal thinker for Schmidt, and he needs someone else to buttress his idea of the nomos of the earth. And he goes to Aristotle, which is paradoxically because Aristotle is supposed to be the Republican Christian thinker. So that now why, but I'm pretty sure there's that shift. And that shift is parallel to Strauss, because you're right, and I think perhaps not right about the early Strauss. I think the early Strauss, and he says so, he says that Plato is simply right about everything. He says, this is the standpoint of my thinking, Leo Strauss, that Plato was right about every single thing. The problem is then, well, both rhetorically, what do you do when, you have thinkers like Kelson, but also Popper, and so on, that are saying, well, Plato is really a totalitarian thinker. We're coming out of totalitarianism. How do you hold on to this idea that Plato is right about everything? And so this is what prompts, I think, Strauss. He has to account for why the philosopher king is not a solution that will work in democratic societies, but he still wants to hold the kernel of Platonism, that there is a radical distinction between wisdom and what the masses understand and are capable of doing. And I think what motivates him is that the modern democracy is also mass democracy, and mass democracy is, conducive to also totalitarian regimes. So he needs to keep that distinction, but he has to work it now, not in a, let's say, typically Platonic way, but through Aristotle. That is my hypothesis.
Sorry to interrupt you, but this seems extremely paradoxical, because he has all the material in Plato himself to find this tension between the wisdom and yes, consent. So and it's so obvious that it's strange to have to recur to Aristotle in order to get beyond Plato.
No, that's right. But I think it's because he says it in his book on the man and the city and the laws, or for whatever it's called, the man and the city, or the city and man. He says that it was Aristotle who invented the discipline of political science, and therefore all of social sciences. That Socrates himself was involved in a conception of the philosophical life that was political, but not political in the terms that a polis would understand as political. And Aristotle had to bridge that gap. That's his take. Aristotle politics is trying to bridge whatever, but and I think fascinating Kelson and Epicurus. I think that's right, and it would fit with Kelson's idea that basically all moral values are relative and subjective, and therefore that legality is the only way that we can keep together different people living in the same organization. I mean, that's really interesting. I don't know if Kelson, I would have to look it up, whether Kelson, because Kelson dedicated a lot of time to Plato and Aristotle and classical natural right, but I'm not sure if you ever looked into Epicurus' theory of law. Of course, you're right, Goldschmidt and so on. And lastly, Supio, yes, that's right. Yes, I mean, you know that right now, Schmidt's Nomos of the Earth, despite being extremely right-wing and apparently pro-imperialist tract, is also being read very carefully by decolonial thinkers who say that, well, Schmidt said it. What else do we need to say? Basically, colonialism and imperialism is land grabbing and denial of more concrete orders that were already there, like, for example, in indigenous knowledges and dash law. Everywhere. So in a way, there is a way of flipping Schmidt, and Schmidt actually tried to flip himself to say that he was post-colonial before post-colonial in the 60s.
Yeah, thanks.
Miguel, I wondered if I could press you into elaborating something which you said in passing, which I think our audience might not be as versed in as you are. And that is this neo-Aristotelian conception of law, which has come to dominate the kind of world order because of people like Jacques Maritain. Could you flesh out that a little bit? And I think it could be a segue into thinking about our contemporary moment and the way in which these different views of law relate to our moment, our contemporary crisis. But anyway, if you could talk a little bit about this, Maritain and the neo-Aristotelian conception of law, I think that would be a good place to start.
Yeah, well, Maritain is just the main philosophical figure who pushed for human rights already at the end of the 1930s, right? A doctrine of human rights precisely to counter the emerging totalitarianisms, right? And he did so based on his Thomism, and therefore also going back to Thomas's reading of Aristotle, that somehow we needed, a conception of natural right that was A, moral, B, had some reference to individual dignity and to some sort of subjective conception of right, and that it would trump any a legal order set up by any Führer or something, and so this opened up. So if it's not just, it's not legal, right? Thomas citing Augustine, that became the kind of Anglo-American take on natural right that we then find in Finnis and so on and so forth, right? More sophisticated or whatever, it doesn't matter, but that's the lineage. And that's the kind of lineage that Schmidt and Strauss were actually fighting against, because they thought that this subjectivization of law ultimately ended up undermining the very idea of a legal order. Okay, and this now the debate is ongoing, because if you open up any book by Brian Tierney, for example, he will argue against Strauss and Villet and all the others, and he will say that this distinction between an objective conception of law, which is ultimately spatially grounded, and a subjective conception of law, which is grounded in individual will, that they can't really be separated. So Tierney has many writings criticizing Michel Villet's idea that modern conceptions of law start, he claims they start with Occam and so on. But the point is that the subjective objective is something questionable. But I think I don't know. There's a lot there. But that's what's at stake in in maritime. And so people like Villers will want to go through Aquinas and then back to Aristotle to show, like, look, Aristotle had an objective conception of the law of to dikaion, not a subjective one, and that individual rights make absolutely no sense in an Aristotelian system. And if this is true, of course, it would collapse the whole Aristotelian Thomistic background for the use of natural right in the 20th century by people who wanted to support human rights as something which are supra-state-based law and that pose really boundaries, to talk like Ben had said, to sovereignty of the states. That's what's at issue.
Thanks.
Now, sorry, there's another thing to say. Another chapter to this is of course the role of Vittoria, right? The greatest neo-Aristotelian thinker of law in the Spanish Salamanca school, who is now seen to be as the decisive thinker for the whole idea of an international system of law. So that's the other way in which a Christian Aristotelianism captures the world. I mean, they literally captured the Americas, but then they based a theory of law that would somehow justify this division of the whole world. And Schmidt, of course, that's what he talks about in the Nomos of the Earth. And Vittoria does that on strictly Christian Aristotelian grounds. Now, someone like Villers and all these people from the right, they would say that Vittoria had precisely the problem was his Christian interpretation of Aristotle, which subjectivized everything. The to dikaion was subjectivized. It was not understood as a grounded division of place. Basically, it's how I would define that.
Thanks. So I want to ask a slightly contentious question, and if there's no other questions in the audience, I might indulge myself. Are there any other questions before I find the bullet? Okay. So this is my question. I hope it makes sense. So I'm asking this on behalf of Vladimir Putin. So recently, Putin, in one of his speeches says, rules-based international order, like, who made this order? Who agreed to this order, right? And I wondered, like, if you could kind of channel these different approaches to the question of law and an international order and to answer the question that Putin asks, because it seems like it's directly related to exactly the theorization that you're talking about.
Yeah, I was just giving a paper last week on Putin and all this. No, that's correct, and he's just channeling badly digested Schmidt, basically, right? That Schmidt always questioned the post-war international order, and he proposed instead an international order based on what are called great spaces, Großräume, right? Which is not the Lebensraum of Hitler, but not entirely different either. And what Putin is doing with Ukraine is basically applying this, right? So Ukraine belongs to the Großräume of Russia, right? And we know that Schmidt's work on international law is being read and applied, however dastardly, actually both in Moscow and in Beijing. It's very popular, this kind of thinking. Mm-hmm. So that's one route for, right? But on the other hand, it must be said, and this brings me to the post-colonial, decolonial perspective, that a lot of people are looking at the way in which Schmidt taught us how to read the Salamanca school and Vittoria, for example, and how they go about justifying empire, right? And that's a very complicated debate. There's a very interesting book now by Koskenemi on the roots of international law from 1300s onwards. It's about 2,000 pages. Good luck with that. But Vittoria is the big figure here, is the central figure. And what is interesting to me is that Vittoria wanted to criticize completely the idea that there was a right of discovery or that conquest gave you right to own and do things in the Americas. So he wanted to criticize, in fact, even the theological reasons behind the Spanish and Portuguese conquest. But he did not draw the conclusion that they have to go back to Europe and give to the native nations what is theirs. His conclusion was we have to set up a global system of law, so it's the first properly international system of law that would recognize the sovereignty and the individual rights of indigenous nations, and at the same time allow for European nations to engage in their commerce and in their trading, and in also the evangelization of the non-Christian barbarian peoples, because he did buy into that. They did bad things as well. So it was better for them to be Christians and maintain their sovereignty than maintain the sovereignty without being Christian. So out of all that spans out, I think, ultimately what we now know as a global international legal system that is being, you ask me, taken down right now. Putin is trying to destroy it. Yeah, and my point was simply, and it's something that I think Ben mentioned or something, it's very interesting that when you talk about certain ideas of Schmitt on nomos, it resonates sometimes it resonates in a very interesting way with what Victoria said, that we must acknowledge that indigenous nations had their own nomoi and they were sovereign on their lands, and so on and so forth. But how do you, so it was not a terra nullius situation. So I think that's where we're at. It's a complicated, on the one hand, a resurgence of new ways of thinking about indigenous nomoi and a breakup of an international post-World War II UN-based international legal order. I don't know what's going to come out of it.
Mm-hmm.
What was the name of that big history you mentioned, the 2,000-page one?
Koskenemi. Koskenemi, I think it's called I don't know what it's called, the origins of international law or something, or no, all over the world or something. I forget, some sort of title like that. You'll see him. Koskenemi is probably the major historian of international law in the world right now.
Thanks. Other questions?
All right.
Thanks so much, Miguel.
Well, thank you. Thank you for listening to it.
Very enjoyable, and I've learned a lot. Please join me in thanking Miguel, and we look forward to welcoming you all back for the next workshop, which will be with Johnny Thacker in when are we? In November.
In November, yeah. On the 8th. The 8th of November, I think, and also on Aristotle. Aristotle is very a la mode.
A la mode, okay.
Look, let me also thank you as well, Miguel, for a very thought-provoking discussion. It's as Tristan rightly said, we do live, it seems, on the cusp of an epistemic change in the world on so many different levels, but on the question of natural right and the rights of nations and so on, yeah, very topical.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much again for your invitation and for the questions. Lovely to see you, Andre. Thank you so much for this.